613.3d, Layer 7d, power and or toughness changes from counter and applied. See Rule 121, counters. 613.3e, Layer 7e. Effects that switch a creature's power and toughness are amplified. Such effects take value of power and apply it to the creature's toughness, and make the value of the toughness and apply it to the creature's power. Example, a 1/3 creature is given a +0/+1 by an effect. Another effect switches the creature's power and toughness. Its new power and toughness is 4/1. A new effect gives the creature +5/+0. Its unswitched power and toughness would be 6/4, so its actual power and toughness is 4/6. Example, a 1/3 creature is given +0/+1 by an effect. Then another event switches the creature's power and toughness. Its new power and toughness is 4/1. If the +0/+1 effect ends before the switch effect ends, the creature becomes 3/1. Example, a 1/3 creature is given +0/+1 by an effect. Then another effect switches that creature's power and toughness. Then another effect switches its power and toughness again. The two switches essentially cancel each other out, and the creature becomes a 1/4. 613.4. The application of continuous effects described by the layer system that is continually and automatically performed by the game, as resulting changes to an object's characteristics are instantaneous. Example, Honor of the Pure is an enchantment that reads white creatures you control get +1/+1. Honor of the Pure is a 2/2 black creature are on the field under your control. If an effect then turns the creature white, layer 5, it gets +1/+1 from Honor of the Pure, layer 7c, becoming 3/3. If the creature's color is later changed to red, layer 5, Honor of the Pure effects stop having to it, and it will return to being a 2/2. Example, Grey Ogre is a 2/2 creature. It is on the battlefield, and effects put into a +1/+1 counter on it, layer 7d, making it 3/3. A spell targeting it that says target creature gets +4/+4 until the end of turn resolves, layer 7c, making it a 7/7. An enchantment that says creatures you control get +0/+2 enter the battlefield, making it a 7/9. An effect that says target creature becomes 0/1 until the end of turn is applied to it, layer 7b, making it 5/8. 0/1, which is +4/+4 from the resolve spell, 0/+2 from the enchantment, and +1/+1 from the counter. 613.5. If an effect would be applied in different layers and or sublayers, the parts of the effect apply in their appropriate ones. If an effect starts to apply in one layer and or sublayer, it will continue to be applied to the same set objects in each other applicable or layer or sublayer. Example, an effect that reads Wild Mongrel gets +1/+1 and becomes the color of your choice until the end of turn. It is both a power and toughness changing effect and the color changing effect. The becomes the color of your choice part is applied in layer 5, and then part is applied in layer 2, and then the it gains haste part is applied in layer 6. Example, an effect that reads all non-creature artifacts become 2/2 artifact creatures until the end of turn is both a type changing effect and a power and toughness setting effect. The type changing effect is applied to all non-creature artifacts in layer 4, and the power and toughness setting is applied to the same permanents in layer 7b, even though those permanents aren't non-creature artifacts by then. Example, Sovgoths and the Restless Tomb is on the battlefield. An effect that says, until the end of turn, target land becomes a 3/3 creature that's still a land. It is applied to it, layers 4 and 7b. An effect that says, target creature gets +1/+1 until the end of turn is applied to it, layer 7c, making it a 4/4 land creature. Then while you have 10 creature cards in your graveyard, you activate Sovgoth's ability. Until the end of turn, Sovgoth the Restless Tomb becomes black and a green land zombie. This creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. It is still a land, layer 4, 5, and 7b. It becomes an 11/11 land creature. If a creature card enters or leaves the graveyard, Sovgoth's power and toughness will be modified accordingly. If the first effect is applied to it again, it'll become a 4/4 land creature again. 613.6. Within a layer or sublayer determining which order of effects are applied, it is usually done using a timestamp system, the effect of which an earlier timestamp is applied before an effect with the later timestamp. 613.6a. Continuous effects generated by the static ability has the timestamp as the object the static ability is on. The timestamp of the effect that created the ability, whichever is later. 613.6b. A continuous effect generated by the resolution of a spell or ability receives a timestamp at the time it's created. 613.6c. An object receives a timestamp at the time it enters a zone. 613.6d. An aura, equipment, or fortification receives a new timestamp at the time it becomes attached to an object or player. 613.6e. A permanent receives a new timestamp at the time it turns face up or face down. 613.6f. A double-face permanent receives a new timestamp at the time it transforms. 613.6g. A face-up playing card, phenomenon card, or scheme card receives a timestamp at the time it's turned face up. 613.6h. A face-up Vanguard card receives a timestamp at the beginning of the game. 613.6i. A conspiracy card receives a timestamp at the beginning of the game. If it's face down, it receives a new timestamp at the time it turns face up. 613.6j. If two or more objects would receive a timestamp simultaneously, such as by entering a zone simultaneously or being attached simultaneously, the active player determines their relative timestamp order at the time. 613.7. Within a layer or sublayer, determining which order are applied is sometimes done using a dependency system. If a dependency exists, it will override the timestamp system. 613.7a. An effect is said to depend on another if a. It is applied in the same layer and if applicable sublayer as the other effect. See rules 313.1 and 313.3. b. Applying the other would change the text to the existence of the first effect. What it applies several dependent effects from a dependency loop. Then this rule is ignored and the effects of the dependency loop are applied in a timestamp order. 613.7c. After each effect is applied, the order of remaining effects is reevaluated and may change if an effect that has not been applied becomes dependent or independent upon other effects that have not been applied. 613.7c. After each effect is applied, the order is remaining effects and it is reevaluated and may change if the effect has not been applied, becomes dependent or independent on one or more other effects that have not been applied. 613.8. One continuous effect can override another. Sometimes the results of the effect determine whether another effect applies it or not, or the effect does. Example, two effects are affecting the same creature, one from an aura that says enhanced creature has flying, and one from an aura that says enchanted creature loses flying. Neither of these depend on the other, since nothing changes what they will or what they doing to it. Applying them in timestamp order means one that was granted last wins, if the same process would be followed. If the same result reached if either the effects had the duration such as target creature loses flying until the end of turn, or came from a non-aura source such as all creatures lose flying. Example, one effect reads white creatures get +1/+1 and another reads enchanted creature is white. The enchanted creature gets +1/+1 from the first effect regardless of its previous color. 613.9. Some conditions affects players rather than objects. For example, an effect might give a player protection from red. All such effects are applied in timestamp order after a determination of object's characteristics. See also the rules for timestamp. 613.10. Some continuous effects game rules rather than objects. For example, if an effect may modify a player's maximum hand size, or say that a creature must attack this turn if able, these effects are applied if after all the continuous effects have been applied. Continuous effects that affect the cost of spells or abilities are amplified according to the other specified in Rule 601.2f. All other such effects are amplified in timestamp order. See also the rules for timestamp order dependency, Rule 613.6 and 613.7. 614. Replacement effects. 614.1. Some continuous effects are replacement effects, like prevention effects. See Rule 615. Replacement effects apply continuous as events happen that they aren't looked at ahead of time. Such effects watch for a particular event that would happen completely or particularly replace the events from which a different event. They act like shields and whatever, and they're affecting. 614.1a. Effects that use the word instead are replacement effects. Most replacement effects use the word instead to indicate that what the events will be replaced with other events. 614.1b. Effects that use the word skip are replacement effects. These replacement effects use the word skip to indicate what events, stems, phases, or turns will be replaced as nothing. 614.1c. Effects that read this permanent enters the battlefield with, as this permanent enters the battlefield, or this permanent enters the battlefield as, are replacement effects. 614.1d. Continue effects that read this permanent enters the battlefield or objects enter the battlefield are replacement effects. 614.1e. Effects that read as this permanent is turned face up are replacement effects. 614.2. Some replacements effects apply to damage from a source. See Rule 609.7. 614.3. There are no special restrictions on casting a spell or activating an ability that generates a replacement effect, such as effects until they are replaced or used in the duration is expired. 614.4. Replacement effects must exist before the appropriate event occurs. They can't go back in time and change something that's already happened. Spells or abilities that generate these effects are often cast or activated in response to whatever would produce them, and the event thus results before the event could occur. Example, a player can activate the ability to regenerate a creature in response to a spell that would destroy him. Once the spell resolves, though, it is still too late to generate the creature. 614.5. A replacement effect doesn't invoke itself repeatedly. It only gets one opportunity to affect an event or any modified events that may replace it. Example, a player controls 2 permanents, each with an ability that reads if a creature you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to a permanent or player instead. A creature that normally deals 2 damage will deal 8 damage, not just 4, and not an infinite amount. 614.6. An event is replaced, it never happens. A modified event occurs instead, which may in turn trigger abilities. Note that the modified event may contain instructions that can't be carried out, in which case the impossible instruction is simply ignored. 614.6. The event is replaced, it never happens. A modified event occurs instead, in which may return trigger abilities. Note that the modified event may contain instructions that can't be carried out, in which case the impossible inclusion is simply ignored. 614.7. The replacement effect would replace an event. That event never happens. The replacement simply does not do anything. 614.7a. If a source would deal 0 damage, it does not deal damage at all. Replacement effects would increase the damage dealt by that source, or would have that source deal that damage to different objects or players. They have no event to replace, and they have no effect. 614.8. Regeneration is a destruction replacement effect. The word instead does not appear on the card, but implicit in the duration and the regeneration. Regenerate permanent means this next time permanent would be destroyed in this turn. Instead, remove all damage marked on it and tap it. If it's an attacking or blocking creature, remove it from combat. Abilities that trigger from damage will be dealt still trigger even if the permanent regenerates. See Rule 701.14. 614.10. An effect that causes the player to skip an event, step, phase, or in turn is replaced effect. Skip something is the same as instead of doing something, do nothing. Once a step, phase, or is turned out, it can no longer be any skip. Effects will remain until the end of occurrence. 614.10a. Anything scheduled for a skipped step, phase, or turn won't happen. Anything scheduled for the next occurrence of something waits for the first occurrence that isn't skipped. If 2 effects such cause a player to skip their next encounter, that player must skip to the next 2. The effects of will be satisfied in skipping the first encounter, while the other will retain until the other occurrence can't be skipped. 614.10b. Some effects cause a player to skip a step, phase, or turn, and then take another action. If the action is considered to be the first thing that happens during the next step, phase, or turn to taken to occur. 614.11. Some effects replace card draws. These effects are applied even if no cards could be drawn, because there are no cards within the affected player's library. 614.11a. An effect replaces a draw within a sequence of card draws. All actions required by the replacement are completed, if possible, before resuming the sequence. 614.11b. If an effect would have a player both draw a card, perform an additional action on that card, then the draw is replaced. The additional action is not performed by any cards that are not drawn as a result of the replacement. 614.12. If some replacement effects modify how a permanent enters the battlefield, see Rule 614.1c to d. Effects such may come from the permanent itself, if they affect only that permanent as opposed to a general subset of permanents that indicate it. They may also come from other sources to determine which replacement effects apply and how they apply. Check the characteristics of the permanent as it would exist on the battlefield, taking into replacement effects that they have already modified into how it enters the battlefield. See Rule 616.1. Continuous effects from the permanents of their own abilities would apply to it once, but once from the battlefield, and continuous effects that already exist would apply to the other permanent. Example, if all says or voice is all enters the battlefield, choose a color, and a voice of all has protection from the chosen color. An effect creates a token that's a copy of voice of all. That token is created. The token's controller chooses a color for it. Example, if Sid Jailer says card in graveyards lose all abilities, Skyward Treefolk says Skyward Treefolk enters the battlefield tapped. A Skyward Treefolk that's put onto the battlefield from a graveyard enters the battlefield tapped. Example, Orb of Dreams is an artifact card that says permanents enter the battlefield tapped. It won't affect itself, so Orb of Dreams enters the battlefield untapped. 614.12a. If a replacement affects the modified of how a permanent enters the battlefield, require a choice. If that choice is made before the permanent enters the battlefield. 614.12b. Some replacement effects cause a permanent to enter the battlefield, which is a controller's choice of one of 2 abilities, each marked with an anchor word that is predicted by the bullet point. Anchor word ability means as long as anchor word was chosen as its permanent enter the battlefield, this permanent has ability. The abilities preceded by anchor words are each linked to the ability that caused the player to lose between them. See Rule 607, linked abilities. 614 to 13. 614.13, an effect that modifies how a permanent enters a battlefield may cause other objects to change zones. 614.13a, while applying an effect that modifies how a permanent enters the battlefield may choose to have a number of objects that will also change zones. You can't choose the object that will become a permanent or any other objects entering the battlefield at the time. Example, Suturated Ghoul says, in part, a Suturated Ghoul enters the battlefield exiled under any number of creatures from your graveyard. If Suturated Ghoul and Runeclaw Bear enter the battlefield from your graveyard at the same time, you can't choose to exile either of them when applying Suturated Ghoul's replacement effect. 614.13b, the same object can't be chosen to choose zones more than once when applying effect replacements that would modify how a single permanent enters the battlefield. Example, Joan, a plain card says, whenever a player card casts a black, red, or green creature spell, it gains Devour 5. A player controls Runeclaw Bear and casts Thunder Thrasher Elder and red creature spells with Devour 3. As Thunder Thrasher Elder enters the battlefield, controller can choose to sacrifice a Runeclaw Bear when applying a Devour 3 effect to the playing player's Devour 5. But not both. Thunder Thrasher Elder will enter the battlefield with 0, 3, or 5 +1/+1 counters on it depending on this choice. An object may have one ability printed on it that generates a replacement effect which causes one or more cards to be exiled, and another ability that refers to the exiled card or two cards exiled with this object. These abilities are linked to the second, refers only to cards in an exiled zone. They were put there as a disturbed result of the replacement event caused by the first. If another object gains a pair of linked abilities, the abilities will be similarly linked in that object. They can't be linked to any other abilities, regardless of what other abilities and objects they currently may have in the past. See Rule 607, Linked Abilities. 614.5. Some replacement effects are not continuous effects, rather they are in effect to a resolving spell or ability and replace part of all the spell's abilities owns effects. Such as effects are called self-replacement effects, and texting and creating a self-replacement effect is usually part of the ability whose effect is being replaced, but the text can be separated ability, particularly when preceded by an ability word. When applying replacement effects to an event, self-replacement effects are applied before the replacement effects. 614.16. Some replacement effects apply if an effect would create one or more tokens, or if an effect would have one or more counters or permanents. These replacement effects apply if the effect of a resolving spell or ability creates a token, puts a counter on a permanent, and then they also apply if another permanent or prevention effects does, though even if the original event being modified wasn't itself an effect. 614.17. Some effects state that something can't happen. These effects aren't replacement effects, but follow similar rules. 614.7a. Can't effects must exist before an appropriate event occurs that they go back in time and change something that's already happened. 614.17b. If an event can't happen, a player can't choose to pay a cost that includes that event. 614.17c. If an event can't happen, it can only be replaced by self-replacement effects. See Rule 614.15. Other replacements and or prevention effects can't modify or replace it. 614.17d. Some can't effects modify how a permanent enters the battlefield or whether it can enter the battlefield. Such effects may come from the permanent itself if they affect only that permanent as opposed to a general subset of permanents that include it. They may also come from other sources to determine which can't effects. Check the characteristics of the permanent as it would exist on the battlefield, taking into account replacement effects that have already modified how it enters the battlefield. See Rule 616.1. Continuous effects from the permanent's own statistic abilities would apply to it once it's on the battlefield, and continuous effects already exist and would apply to on the permanent. 615. Prevention effects. 615.1. Some continuous effects on the prevention effects like replacement effects. See Rule 614. Prevention effects apply continuously as events happen that they aren't locked in ahead of time. Such effects watch for a damage event that would happen and completely partially prevent the damage that would be dealt. They act like shields around whatever they're affecting. Effects that would use the word prevent and prevention effects. Prevention effects use prevent to indicate all damage that would be dealt. 615.2. Many prevention effects apply to damage from a source. See Rule 609.7. 615.3. There are no special restrictions on casting spells or activating an ability that generates a prevention effect. Such effects last until they are used up or their duration has expired. 615.4. Prevention events must exist before the appropriate damage event occurs. They can't go back in time and change something that's already happened. Spells or abilities that generate these effects are often cast on activated. If you pause on this bit, you're a faggot. On the events afterwards. 615.6. If damage that would be dealt is prevented, it never happens. A modified event may occur instead, which in turn triggers abilities. Note that the modified event may contain instructions that can't be carried out, in which case the impossible intrusion is simply ignored. 615.7. Some prevention effects generated by the resolution of the spells or abilities refer to a specific amount of damage. For example, prevent the next 3 damage that would be dealt to any target this turn. These work like shields. Each 1 damage that would be dealt to the shielded permanent or player is prevented. Preventing 1 damage reduces the remaining shield by 1. If damage would be dealt to the shielded permanent or player by 2 or more applicable sources at the same time, the player or the controller of the permanent chooses which damage the shield prevents. Once the shield has been reduced to 0, any remaining damage is dealt normally. Such effects count on the amount of damage, the number of events, or the source dealing it. It doesn't matter. 615.8. Some prevention effects generated by the resolution of the spells or abilities refer to the next time a specific source would be dealt. These effects prevent the next instance of damage from a source, regardless of how much damage it is. Once an instance of damage from that source has been prevented, any subsequent instances of damage would be dealt by that source are dealt normally. 615.9. Some effects generated by the resolution of a spell or an ability prevent damage from a source of a player's choice with certain projectiles. Properties. When the source of would be dealt damage, the shield rechecks the source's properties. If the properties are no longer matched, the damage isn't prevented or replaced, and the shielded isn't used up. See Rule 609.7b. 615.10. Some prevention effects generated by static abilities refer to a specific amount of damage. For example, if a source would deal damage to you, prevent 1 of that damage. If an effect prevents only the indicated amount of damage in any applicable damage event at any given time, it will apply separately to damage from other capable events that would happen at the same time or at a different time. Example, Daunting Defender says, if a source would deal damage to a cleric creature you control, prevent 1 of that damage. Pyroclasm says, Pyroclasm deals 2 damage to each creature. Pyroclasm will deal 2 damage to each cleric creature controlled by Daunting Defender's control. It will deal 2 damage to each other creature. 615.11. Some prevention effects prevent the next end damage that would be dealt to each number of untargeted creatures. Such an effect creature, that prevention or shield, or each applicable creature, then the spell or ability that will generate each resolves. Example, Wojak Apothecary has an ability that says T prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to target creature and other creatures that shares a color with it this turn. When the ability resolves, the ability gives the target each and other creature on the battlefield that share a color with it at the pass of the shield, preventing the next 1 damage that will be dealt. Changing creatures' colors after the ability resolved doesn't add or remove shields. The creatures that enter the battlefield later in the turn don't get the shield. 615.12. Some effects state that the damage can't be prevented. If unpreventable damage would be dealt, any applicable prevention effects are still applied to it. Those effects won't prevent any damage, but the additional effects they have will take place. Existing damage prevention shields won't be reduced by damage that can't be prevented. 615.12a. A prevention effect is applied to any particular unpreventable damage even just once. It won't invoke itself repeatedly trying to prevent that damage. 615.13. Some triggered abilities trigger when damage that would be dealt is prevented. Such an ability triggers each time a prevention effect is applied to 1 or more simultaneous damage events and prevents some or all of that damage. 616. Interactions of replacement and/or prevention effects. 616.1. If 2 or more replacement and/or prevention effects are attempting to modify the way an event affects an object or player, the effects, object's controller, or its owners, or if not controlled, or the affected player choose one to apply following the list and said. If 2 or more players have to make these choices at the same time, choices are made in AP and AP orders. See Rule 101.4. 616. 1a. If any of the replacement and/or prevention effects are self-replacement effects, see Rule 614.15. One of them must be chosen if not produced by Rule 616.1b. If any of the replacement and/or prevention effects would modify under whose control or object of the world enters the battlefield, one of them must be chosen. If not, proceed to Rule 616.1c. 616.1c. If any of the replacement and/or prevention effects would cause an object to become a copy of another object as it enters the battlefield, one of them must be chosen. If not, proceed to Rule 616.1d. 616.1d. Any of the applicable replacements and/or prevention effects may be chosen. 616.1e. Once the chosen effect has been applied, this process has been repeated, taking into account only replacement or prevention effects that would now be applicable. Under there are no more left to apply. Example, 2 permanents are still in the battlefield. One is an attachment that reads if a card would be put into the graveyard from anywhere instead exile it, and the other is a creature that reads if this creature would die, instead shuffle it into its owner's library. If the creature is destroyed, its controller decides which replacement to apply first. The other does nothing. Example, Essence of the Wild reads creatures you control enter the battlefield as a copy of Essence of the Wild. A player who controls Essence of the Wild casts Rusted Sentinel, which normally enters the battlefield tapped, and as it enters the battlefield, the copy effect from the Essence of the Wild is applied first. As a result, it no longer has the ability that causes it to enter a battlefield tap. Rusted Sentinel will enter the battlefield as an untapped copy of Essence of the Wild. Effects from Essence of the Wild is applied first. As a result, it no longer has the ability to enter the battlefield tapped. Rusted Sentinel will enter the battlefield as an untapped copy of Essence of the Wild.